Morning. It's Monday, April 6th. We're going to continue on our history lesson. We are in the interwar period. We have addressed life politically for Britain, for France, for the United States, and now we're going to return to Russia. It's going to involve a little bit of a rewind. We're going to look at the last days of Tsarist Russia as we enter into the new Soviet period. So, Russia had a long history of persecuting various groups. The Tsar was an autocrat, meaning one who ruled absolutely by himself with no other consulting authorities. And for many years, the most important thing for the Tsar was to keep Russia united. And the best way to do that was to have one religion, one people, which normally meant having to get rid of all those who were different. So Russia looked down on everything that was non-Russian. They were extremely ethnocentric and racist. This included national groups such as the Poles, the Finns, and the Jews. Each of these ethnic groups have stories of horror from the way they were treated by the Russians during the pre-World War I period. These organized government massacres were often called pogroms. Pogroms usually applied to the Jews, but also applied to various other ethnic groups. Finland has a rich history of hating the Russians for what the Russians did to him. That'll actually come into play at the beginning of World War II. Though a better man than many of his predecessors, we talked about Tsar Nicholas II, he allowed these tyrannical policies to continue. Even before World War I, Nicholas I was already very unpopular. Now, that wasn't unusual. Most czars were unpopular. Very few of them were ever loved. It didn't bother the czars because Russia had an extensive secret police and an army who had no problem destroying their own people if need be. So the arrival and upheaval caused by Vladimir Lenin and the communists was a new challenge, but it wasn't necessarily surprising. In many ways, the czar had seen people like this before. You simply round them up and execute them. Most reformers and radicals in Russia were divided into two groups. One were called the Bolsheviks and the other were called the Mensheviks. The Bolsheviks were smaller. They were the hardcore communists. They were more extreme. The Mensheviks were more like European liberals. Later on, the Bolsheviks would be called the Reds and the Mensheviks would be called the Whites. Now, these two groups have been stirring in Russia since 1900. Both the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks, they wanted change. The Bolsheviks wanted go full-on Marxism, the battle of the bourgeois versus the proletariat. The Mensheviks were more of the democratic socialism. They all wanted the same end goal, socialism, but they had different ways of getting there. The disastrous Russo-Japanese War had humiliated the Tsar and the Russians' military, the two consistent forces of order in the country. That led to a surprising development. Open but orderly protesters bearing a petition for the Tsar. So here we are after the defeat in 1905. You have Russian people rising up and appealing directly to the Tsar. The Tsar did not know what to do. This was a new thing. Nobody really knew what to do. In the confusion, there was the order given to fire. And so thousands of Russian civilians were executed by the army on what was called Bloody Sunday. And so here are the people right here being led. This man in the middle is a Russian Orthodox priest, and they were just mowed down. As unrest increased, labor unions were formed. People wanted to gather to provide some organization apart from government, that would give them representation. They often fought against the government. They used the power of the strike to do so. So workers would group together and they would refuse to work until they were granted certain concessions. In order to coordinate, they organized themselves into councils that were called Soviets. So Soviet was a council with representatives from various labor unions. Eventually, this is what granted the people the right of a Duma. The Duma was a Russian parliament. By the time World War I started, things were very precarious. Nicholas II, he, as Tsar, tried to take personal command. That did not work well because he was not up to the challenge. His wife, Empress Alexandra, was being counseled by a strange Russian monk named Rasputin. Rasputin was thought of by everyone as a fraud, but the Tsarina believed he was true. The Tsar and Tsarina's eldest son had a blood condition, and he was very sickly, often near death. One particular time it looked like he was going to die. Rasputin came in, prayed, did something, and he survived the night. And from that moment, the Tsarina was convinced that he was a man of God. Eventually, Rasputin was assassinated by others who opposed him. Although even that, there's a lot of stories historically about what really happened. He may have, it looks like they tried poisoning him, that failed. They tried drowning him, and then in the end, I think they just shot him. But this was Rasputin. He eventually did die, no doubt about it. But it was quite an ordeal to even get there. And he was killed because he was perceived as having a bad influence upon the royal family. In March 1917, Russia was 3 years into World War I. Russia was doing poorly. Their armies have been beaten time and time again. The people were experiencing the lack of food, lack of direction. Riots broke out in the capital at St. Petersburg. In a change, the troops joined with the rioters. So rather than the troops destroying the rioters, the troops joined with the rioters, and this was really the end of the government. Nicholas disbanded the Duma, but they ignored him. They formed a new government with the Mensheviks. There was one in particular named Alexander Kerensky. He was the head of the government. With chaos reigning, the Bolsheviks began working. Lenin at this time, Vladimir Lenin, had been taken by the Germans and reinserted into Russia, where he had once been exiled. The first elections in Russia took place in January 1918. Lenin's party only gained a quarter of the vote. That's not much. Because of the confusion, however, Lenin was able to maneuver his small communist party to control power, even though they were a small minority. He made sure he had his people in key positions in government. They were controlling the flow of money, the flow of information. They had what they needed. So even though they were never a majority, in fact, they were a serious minority, they were able to work well outside their own power because they were in the right place. Lenin made promises that he knew he would never fulfill and was able to rally a degree, although nowhere near a majority of public support, in early 1918. So now you have this government being headed by Kerensky. You have the Reds, the Bolsheviks, working against the Whites, the Mensheviks, and vice versa. Everyone's trying to control the government. The Tsar and his family are under house arrest, and a number of major Russian cities were facing major food shortages. Like famine was a real threat. The people didn't care about political squabbles. They needed to eat. They didn't care if it was the Whites who were in charge or the Reds who were in charge. They cared about food. Lenin's solution was to confiscate grain from the peasants. He believed that the peasants were hoarding the grain from the cities. So he took the grain from the peasants. That brought the peasants starvation, and it made them enemies. In response, Lenin sent his secret police that had been reformed, the Chekists and the NKVD and others, among the peasants, and he publicly tortured and executed them. In fact, even if they had done nothing wrong, he demanded in every even minor town, he told his minions that it was important that a certain number of primary peasants, important men of town, were brought into the town square, publicly tortured, and then executed. Just didn't care who, just kill them. And so all over Russia, under orders of Lenin, under the communists, this is what socialism brings, thousands and thousands of innocent people, hardworking people who had been the backbone of Russia for generations were being tortured and publicly executed. His great contribution to politics was that he believed terror was not something you should avoid. Rather, terror was a tool to be used. You should unleash terror upon the population, make them obey you. He wanted the people to live in fear. He didn't want resistance. This resulted in more starvation. If you take the most prosperous peasants, the ones who were the best at growing grain, and you murder them, what happens? Well, you get less grain. It also brought civil war. So Leon Trotsky, who was one of Lenin's assistants, Leon Trotsky was able to organize a Red Army in opposition to the White Army. So the Red Army was Lenin, Trotsky, and the other hardcore communists, the Bolsheviks. The White Army was Kerensky and the other Mensheviks. Now, they would have been a form of socialist, but not the extreme communist. This was a propaganda tool. You'll see the glorious white horse of the White Army over the red dragon and slaying it. So these were the forces of Kerensky and the White Army as they were trying to rally support from the people to oppose the Reds. As the Reds, the communists were able to expand their territory and they killed opponents. And both sides did this, but the Reds especially. Whenever Lenin and his group would win a battle, they would find all who stood against them and just murder them. They assumed greater governmental power. The capital was moved back to Moscow. And in 1921, Lenin was pretty much firmly in command of all of Russia, and he launched what was called the New Economic Plan. So in 1921, Russia was near absolute starvation. Lenin still only had a minority of the population supporting him, but he was in control. Communism was not working. Pure socialism was still not producing enough food. In fact, it was producing less and less food. And so the New Economic Plan was a response to famine and widespread starvation. Under communist rule, industry and agricultural were in just absolute free fall. Things were a disaster. What the New Economic Plan did is it actually brought back limited elements of capitalism because it was the only way that they could survive the starvation. Communism and socialism does not sustain itself. It eventually dies. It was little bits of capitalism that kept the nation afloat, and that was called the New Economic Plan. It was during this time Lenin oversaw the formation of what he called the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. So rather than just Russia, now you bound together all the other republics, all these other Soviets, and they became one empire, essentially, the USSR, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. This was really one of Lenin's last achievements. He suffered a series of strokes and died in 1924. So really, Lenin was only in power, you can say, anywhere from 1919 to 1924, or some people identify as 1921. He was, in that short time, responsible for an estimated 4 million deaths. And by the way, these weren't deaths of the enemies of Russia or the USSR. These were deaths of Russian people. You need to realize as students, violence is not a bug in the socialist communist system. Violence is a feature of the socialist communist system. When socialism and communism came, it brought death with it. And Lenin made sure people realized that terror was a tool to be used by the state to compel people to obey the state and to do what he had said. So he died in 24. Before he died, he recognized that upon his death, there would be a power struggle to see who would become the next premier or leader of the Soviet Union. There were a couple people who were likely. Trotsky was one of them, but there was a very ambitious young man who had taken the name, wasn't his real name, but had taken the name of Joseph Stalin. And before he died, Lenin tried to demote Stalin to make sure he wasn't in a position to take over. He failed to do so. And so we're going to see in the days, months, and years ahead how Joseph Stalin rises to become the next leader of the USSR and what he does in response. So trust this has been helpful. We're trying to review Russian history, especially during this interwar period as we set ourselves up for what happens in World War II. All right. I'll post again tomorrow. I'll give you, starting tomorrow, more information about upcoming test quizzes and homework so we can all be on the same page. Have a good day.